All right, I think we are back with Pythagoras, a philosophy of whole systems. Should come as no surprise that the figure of Pythagoras appealed strongly to those scholars of Renaissance Italy, as he has invariably appealed to the more universal thinkers of every age, so he's a universal thinker. The appeal lies in his important and influential conceptions, which in many ways seem to directly reveal important principles existing at the sacred root of nature's fount, but also in the man's character, for Pythagoras himself seems to well represent the possibility of an integrated approach to the study of nature as a philosophical way of life. And relating back to the Ebert Commons discussion, I think they were talking about, Commons was talking about, or Kamens was saying that there used to be this conception that you could know everything. So this is like a medieval conception, the conception of the scholar and scholasticism. The point was to know everything about herbology and medicine and theology, that these were all fields in the liberal arts that you could master. Like you could master mathematics because it really only went up to algebra and geometry. There was no calculus to speak of. So you could theoretically master known mathematics. You could master known theology. You could read the Bible front to back. You could master medicine. You could master alchemy, although alchemy was a little more of a Faustian infinite space aesthetic where the Philosopher's Stone hadn't actually been attained. So that was a little more controversial. You could master astronomy in the sense that you could see the movements of the stars and the planets and track their movements and predict their movements. So there was a concept that you could master knowledge of the world to a degree, to an extent. You couldn't predict all of the actions of the weather, for example, so meteorology, and that those sort of unknowable those known unknowns were given unto the mind of God. So God knew how those things worked, and we could never know. So there was a containment of knowledge. There was a limited perceptual field that we operated within, similar to a video game, which is not infinite. There are a limited number of variables to deal with. That was the perception. And then with science, things became specialized into their fields. Like you could not know everything about medicine anymore because it was this Faustian expansion. So to know everything up to the present day of what was going on in medicine, you'd have to constantly be researching it, dedicating your life to it. Same thing with physics, the discovery of electricity, electromagnetism. All of these things made specialization more and more prevalent, so that you couldn't speak of a doctor anymore, a doctor of philosophy, a lover of knowledge. PhD, that term, it used to be a singular term, just meaning someone who, was a knowledgeable person. But now it was speciated into different fields. So you're a PhD of math, you're a PhD of biology, you're a PhD of English, or whatever. These fields speciated, and you can no longer speak of a person who knew about everything. But at the same time, the mind of God was erased, and there was this theory that, well, if we add up all of these fields together, then we know everything, essentially. So there was an absorption of the mind of God, whereas before there's this dualism between the scholar who knows everything there is to know humanly possible, and then there's the mind of God that covers everything else. After some kind of like alchemical process, we move into the scientific age. Now everything's speciated, so no single person can know everything. But if you add up the sum of human knowledge, then you pretty much get all there is to know about everything. So there is a simultaneous humbling of the individual, but an aggrandizement of humanity, which we might call humanism. So just etymologically, that term humanism, meaning that no individual is perfect, but as a whole, humanity can attain some kind of like godlike divinity. That is essentially one meaning of humanism, and it does relate historically to the movement that is concurrent with the alchemical trend in Europe that eventually ends up with science. All right, so Pythagoras is talking about the integrated person, the integrated approach to the study of nature. And Commons was starting to talk about how we're reapproaching that scene where, because of things like Wikipedia, you can know a little bit about everything. And so we're moving back, we moved into this scene of specialization. Now we're moving out of that back into a, you have to know a little bit of coding, and you have to know a little bit of rhetoric, and you have to know a little bit of history, and you have to know a little bit of politics. You have to know a little bit of everything. Be a jack of all trades, be a bachelor of arts, and only then can you be successful. And that's the new dichotomy, I suppose, between the specialized man who's very focused on his field, sort of like I don't know who would really archetypally represent this in terms of finance, but I'm just thinking how, in terms of today, the CEO is expected to know a little bit of everything about the company. Nothing substantial. He's not the best about anything, but he knows a little bit of everything about how the company works. He's a cosmopolitan man. He knows everything. Versus, I'm trying to think of who would accurately represent the reverse. Would it be someone like Henry Ford, or not even Elon Musk? Because Elon Musk is an engineer, but again, he dips his hands in a little bit of everything. He's not obsessive about any one thing in terms of merchandising, and maybe this is just a perennial thing, that rich people are not people who specialize. There is a mass perception that in order to be financial, if you're poor, it's because you didn't specialize. But a successful person is someone who specializes and becomes obsessive about a particular field. It's not really the case. Truly, the richest people in the world are not people who obsessively specialize about any one thing. They become the best programmer in the world. They become the best athlete in the world. They become the best whatever in the world. Mathematician, doesn't matter. Those people are not the richest people. The richest people are the people who know a little bit about everything. So they can be sociable, but they can also be intellectual. And they can be mathematical, but they can also be rhetorical. So they dip their fingers in a little bit of everything, and in that way they're able to skim, they're able to grasp the whole of society and pick the easiest, ripest, most accessible, low-hanging fruits. And that's, making money the smart way rather than the hard way. All right, so going on from there, as we have seen, the central focus of Pythagorean thought is in many respects placed on the principle of harmonia. The universe is one, but the phenomenal realm is a differentiated image of this unity. The world is a unity in multiplicity. What maintains the unity of the whole, even though it consists of many parts, is the hierarchical principle of harmony, the logos of relation, which enables every part to have its place in the fabric of the all. Because of Pythagoras' approach, integrating mathematics, psychology, ethics, and political philosophy into one comprehensive whole, it would be quite inappropriate to end this essay without devoting a few words to the contemporary significance of the Pythagorean approach. Pythagoras would have never wished that his insights remained the focus of a merely antiquarian interest, so we shall honor his intentions by inquiring into what value Pythagorean thought might possess in the contemporary world, addressing these matters in quite general terms. Pythagoras, no doubt, would have disapproved of the radical split which occurred between the sciences and philosophy during the 17th century Enlightenment, which still haunts the intellectual and social fabric of Western civilization to this day. In retrospect, perhaps we can see that man is most happily at home in the universe as long as he can relate his experiences to both the universal and the particular, the eternal and the temporal levels of being. Natural science takes an Aristotelian approach to the universe, delighting in the multiplicity of the phenomenal web. It is concerned with the individual parts as opposed to the whole, and its method is one of particularizing the universal. Natural science attempts to quantify the universal through the reduction of living form and qualitative relations to mathematical and statistical formulations based on the classification of material artifacts. By contrast, natural philosophy is primarily Platonic in that it is concerned with the whole as opposed to the part, realizing that all things are essentially related to certain eternal forms and principles. The approach of the natural philosopher strives to understand the relation that the particular has with the universal. Through the language of natural philosophy and through the Pythagorean approach to whole systems, it is possible to relate the temporal with the eternal and to know the organic relation between multiplicity and unity. If the scientific spirit is seen as the desire to study the universe in its totality, it will be seen both approaches are complementary and necessary in scientific inquiry, for an inclusive cosmology must be equally at home in dealing with the part or the whole. The great scientists of Western civilization, Kepler, Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, and those before and after were able to combine both approaches in a valuable and fruitful way. I don't know, I would tack on Einstein with Newton, Copernicus, and Kepler. Kepler and Copernicus were obviously concerned with astronomy and the relation of different heavenly bodies to one another. Newton was interested in earthly phenomenon that then related to the moon. So why does the apple fall to the ground? Why does the moon revolve around the earth? And saw a common cause there. And then Einstein was dealing with why do Newtonian mechanics of gravity, why do they not work in certain circumstances? Really, Einstein seemed to be more delving into the photoelectric effect and these sort of calculations. And there's, of course, controversy over, when we look at different, so even Newton, when we talk about Newton, to me, the primary invention there is not of, it's not of all his stuff on, he did work on light, and he did work on gravity, obviously, but I think his most significant invention was calculus. But that's even controversial because Leibniz also claimed to have invented calculus. So who invented it first? Did they invent it independently? That's a controversy. And then, whereas Kepler and Copernicus are a little more straightforward, Newton gets controversial in that aspect of what was his greatest invention or discovery. And then Einstein is also controversial because popularly he's thought of as being the father of relativity, but really, his Nobel Prize was for the photoelectric effect, and there were a lot of other people who were working into that stuff at the time. I'm interested to see that those are the four scientists mentioned and not someone like, Tesla, and then the history of electricity, studies into electricity between Tesla and then Edison, who was primary there, who was more important. So, I don't know about that list. I don't know if those are the four best names to choose. But anyway, we're just going to continue to keep reading. It is interesting that the split between science and philosophy coincides roughly with the Industrial Revolution, for once freed from the philosophical element which anchors scientific inquiry to the whole of life and human values. Science ceases to be science in the traditional sense and is transformed into a servile nursemaid of technology. The development and employment of mechanization. Now, machines are quite useful as long as they are subservient to human good and all the ramifications of that word, but as it turned out, the Industrial Revolution also coincided with a mechanistic conceptualization of the natural world and natural order, which sought to increase material profit at expense of the human spirit. This era, which gave rise to the nightmare of the modern factory, William Blake's dark satanic mills, literally referring to mills being like mills of grain, what was the other one? The hoppers of grain, and the wheels of clothing, making clothing. Those early factories gained its strength through the naive premise that the human spirit might be elevated and perfected through the agency of a machine. Today, in many circles, to a large part fueled by the desire for economic reward, science has nearly become confused with and subservient to technology. And from this perspective, it might be said that the ideal of a universal or inclusive science has been lost. This is because the ideal scientist is also a natural philosopher who is interested in relating his discoveries to a larger universal framework, whereas the dull-minded technologist, if he has any interest in universal principles at all, limits their interest to their specific mechanistic applications rather than their intrinsic worth of study. Yet those who study universal principles as principles in themselves often find that these principles have many applications in a wide variety of fields. So this is interesting because something I was thinking about was like paganism, pre-Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, and then like nominalism and materialism and some of these things. So we would assume that the most basic way that a human animal can relate to the world is a kind of pantheism where a rock is a god and the animal is a god and a person is god, and like your organs are separate from each other. Like you have a thumos, and that's like one part of yourself with its own independent personality, and then like the mind and the heart and the different humors of the body. So everything is radically divine and worthy of reverence. Like the clouds are gods and the trees are gods and the streams are gods and everything. You're just constantly in a dream state where everything is radically divine and everything has intrinsic meaning and worth. And like the Heidegger talks about, I'm picking this up from Ebert, where Heidegger is talking about like the pouring of like water out of a jug or out of a bowl is like representative of Mother Gaia, like pouring out her liquid upon nature to make things fertile or something like that. So the mother goddess, I don't know. But everything is metaphorical. Everything has like a double meaning. Everything relates to like the ancestors, and everything that happens is of divine consequence. So we get bad weather because we did bad things, and then we need to sacrifice goats to get good weather. So this is like the primordial human animal perceiving the world. And then from there, we get maybe like a pre-Pythagoreanism where you start to see unity between different phenomena. So you start to see like, hey, there are the sun, it goes up and down every day, okay, and it happens in like divisible units. We could say like there's the night and there's the day. And we could divide up like these units into some kind of framework of something. We'll just invent a unit like an hour. We'll say like, oh, there are 24 hours in a day, and they're on the solstice. There are let me think of this. No, the equinox. Equinox is the word I'm looking for. So in the equinox, there are exactly 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. Okay, so now we have these numbers somehow. We have these numbers with which we can track the amount of daylight, the amount of nighttime. And then we can start looking at the stars and be like, okay, well, there are these patterns up there in the stars, and over many, many days, things actually change. So the most basic one, probably the biggest quote-unquote celestial object, so I'm using that in a very broad sense of just things that primitive humans can look up at the night sky and see and track, would be the moon. The moon is probably the easiest thing that we can look up and track besides the sun, and the moon goes through these phases, and they actually repeat in cycles of 28. So every 28 days, the moon goes from being a full moon to then a 3/4 and a half moon, and then a quarter moon, and then it's just a little sliver, and then it's a new moon, and it's just totally blacked out. And you can start to come up with hows and whys and explanations of what's going on there. But at the very least, you can start tracking it and say, okay, there's a numerological cycle. We can count and we can predict, and we can use the phases of the moon. We can relate that to the hours in the day. We can see that these numbers here are significant. Numbers are important. Something's going on here that has predictive power. And then you can start to track like, hey, based on the moon, I know that there are this many days left until the harvest, so we need to start preparing for the harvest. And that helps you develop your society. So you've gone from just walking in a dreamscape, it's like you're dependent on your instincts, and you're just walking through life, and like the stream is magical and the rocks are divine and they're speaking to you, and it's like this pre-bicameral mind where you're just schizophrenic and you're just hearing the gods in your head all the time, and like your thumos is speaking to you. You go from that to you're starting to do more like pattern recognition. You're starting to see, okay, there are a certain number of hours in the day, or there are certain phases of the moons. We can track these using discrete numbers. These numbers are not like they are not ambiguous in the sense that like this rock is ambiguous. Like at first it's a rock, but then you have a hallucination and it's a burning bush, and then it starts talking to you and it starts telling you to like, go north, my son. So there's these Of course, this is a story I'm telling. It would be difficult to prove to you, hey, I actually have evidence that this is how people thought way back in the day. But this is the narrative that I'm forming here, where you go from just people walking around and everything is magical all the time. It's like this magical realism. You move from that to then you have the introduction of like a pre-Pythagoreanism where, okay, now we have numbers, and those are discrete entities that we can have like a metaphysical certitude that these things exist, and they're distinguishable, and they're not ambiguous in the sense that there's not this schizophrenic waves of consciousness and confusion. It just is what it is. It's something that you can rely upon. So you move from one stage to the next, and then from the pre-Pythagoreanism, you get to like a full-blown Pythagoreanism. And I'm using those terms to kind of relate to the fact that Pythagoras claimed to have gained all this knowledge by going out to various traditions. He went to the Hyperboreans, the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, whatever. He went to these different cultures, he absorbed the knowledge, and then he syncretized it. But that implies that there was a pre-Pythagoreanism where everything that Pythagoras taught was already known at the time, but it wasn't unified and expressed within that Hellenistic scene to that extent. So we're kind of moving from the Homeric, and then there's some kind of transition period, and then there's Pythagoras. Well, the transition period is that the introduction of numbers. And then at some point with Pythagoras, or the pre-Pythagoreans, numbers become codified, they become divine in their own right. So we move from the period in which like the rock and the stone and the stream is divine, and you worship it, and you're like carving, big titty goth GF, and like, you're finding like Hottentot women in Europe 40,000 years ago, and there's like the worship of Mother Earth, and everything's very Chthonian. Then you're moving to like this Apollonian form, and you start worshiping numbers in themselves, and the repetition of numbers, and golden ratios, and reappearing proportions, and you start creating artwork that is extremely proportional. So you start becoming obsessed with like human forms, and like the structure of the face, and the structure of the body, and the proportion of the arms and the legs and the torso and everything together. And you start making this a math and a science, and you start worshiping, and this is when you see like the koinic statues, I think is what Polya refers to them, but even earlier, you look at the Egyptians, they're obviously obsessed with proportion and art, and bust of Nefertiti, still blows me away to this day. Bust of Nefertiti is something like, if I was just shown that without understanding the historical context, I'd be like, oh, that's probably a statue that like some, 19th century or Renaissance or, someone put together in reference to Egypt. Like in reference to Egypt. Even Greek and Roman statues, like they're so detailed, they're so realistic. It's amazing that you can go from that conceptual space of this hyper-realism of the ancient world, and then you move into the quote-unquote dark ages where people, the medieval biblical drawings are like comic books and stick figures, and it's really pathetic. Like the Anglo-Saxons, like the Bayeux Tapestry, looks silly, it's comical, it's stupid. But, I mean, they obviously perceived it like with this sacred reverence, and they saw it, there was this iconography to it that you see in like Eastern Orthodox churches where Christ is clearly it's not a realistic face, but it's an iconography that you can sacralize. But it's interesting that you move from that hyper-realism, then somehow exhausts itself, and then you go back to a more primitive, crude, cartoonish world that is then sacralized, but then gives birth again through a Renaissance to hyperrealism. But then we've sort of surpassed the hyperrealism, and we've ignored it, and we've overcome it, or it's not relevant anymore. It's not worthy of value anymore. Like if you're able to, depict something in a hyper-realistic manner, no one cares about that. People want the cartoon, or they want the irony, or they want the meme version. They want some distorted version. They want some like cartoonish version of the world. So it's interesting to see those cycles of, we had like the ancient world, or even take Egypt. You had in ancient Egypt in which there was a state of bust of Nefertiti, hyper-realism of form that then devolved over time And then the Hellenic Greeks eventually became hyper-realistic in their art, and sort of took over Egypt, and then they declined over time. And then the Romans grasped the art of hyper-realistic art, and they took over the Egyptians and the Greeks, and then they declined over time.